Cecily Rawlinson, welcome to the Leap Pod. You're currently director of the Cyber West Hub here in Joondalup. What is the Cyber West Hub and how did you arrive there?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's really exciting to be here in these very comfortable chairs and to have a conversation about things that I'm passionate about. So a little bit about me. I'm Cecily. I've been back in Perth for about 4 years, but I grew up here and studied at UWA. And really focused in international relations. That's where I wanted to have a global impact. And that's also what I love about my job today. So even though I work with the local industry, cyber is so international, I'm actually having a global impact. So my career took me a little bit around the world. I lived in Paris for a little while, did my master's in Geneva, and always interested in the intersection of security and then economic development and how they're interrelated, whether it's physical security or diplomatic lens and now cybersecurity. So that's a little bit about me. I discovered innovation and innovation methodologies working on a global project called Innovation for Change in about 2015, and that transformed how I look at problems, how I work with communities, and basically it's a philosophy that I discovered for my life.
So one of the interesting things I noticed about you is in your background, it said something about human-centered. What is human-centered design and innovation, and what does that mean?
Oh, wonderful. Great question. It's probably one of my principles for my entire life. It's something that I discovered when I was working in South Africa on a global innovation project that was designed to work with nonprofits and NGOs. And it's an innovation methodology. So it can be called human-centered design or user-centered design perhaps, but it's the idea that if you go through a design process that really focuses on the human at the center of whatever you're building. So for example, if you're designing a product or an app, you're designing for a particular audience, and then you really dig into who that human is, and you go through an extra stage in your innovation process around empathy to really understand that audience or that person or that human. And that helps you design in a more innovative way. It helps you have more successful products. And I use it for everything. So if you're designing family Christmas, who are the humans I'm designing for? How do I keep them happy? What are their needs? How are they experiencing that day? And that's also what I've taken into the career that I've had. And it's one of my purposes or one of my philosophies is always thinking through who is the human at the center of this process, this tool, this product, and how do I make sure that their experience is as good as possible, and how do I make it as useful as possible to them.
And so how did you end up at Cyber West, and what does Cyber West do for those who aren't familiar with the great work that you are doing in the Perth community?
So I was really looking for something at home that combined my two passions. So something around that global impact, looking at security, how I can be connected to something bigger and actually make a difference in Australians' lives, and then something that's innovative. I wanted to do something that was a little bit different and to practice those skills. I didn't want to lose that as a human-centered design practitioner and an innovation methodology enthusiast. I wanted to make sure I kept growing and learning in that space. So when this role popped up, I was like, well, these are two of the things that I love. I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. So that's sort of how I arrived. I was very lucky to be given the position. Cyber West Hub is WA's cybersecurity innovation hub. So we're the only place in WA that helps grow the local cybersecurity industry, but also aims to uplift the capability of everybody in the state when it comes to cyber.
Okay.
We're hosted by Edith Cowan University, so technically they're my employer, and so we have a great campus in Joondalup, and it's really exciting because they're the epicenter of cybersecurity education in WA. We work with all of the TAFEs and all of the universities, and they all have really good programs, but ECU have some really specky facilities in terms of on-the-job training facilities that are quite large and connections to the Defence Force, which speaks to my international interests. And we're funded by the Department of Jobs, Science, Tourism and Innovation. So we affectionately call them JITSI. And so JITSI fund us through the New Industries Fund. And the purpose of that is really to think about WA's future. How do we diversify our economy? How do we keep growing our economy? We know that climate transition is something that we're going to have as a challenge as a state, and cybersecurity is actually one of our comparative advantages. If you look at other states or cities around Australia and the world, we're actually really good at it, and nobody really knows that. So I like to sing the praises of our local cybersecurity industry and put us on a map in that way, because
Okay.
we're known for mining, we're known for remote ops,
Yeah.
but we're not known for cybersecurity, and we're actually really good at it.
Okay. And is cybersecurity the core focus of the hub? Is that the main item, or are there other items that you are focused on?
So in terms of an industry, certainly the cybersecurity industry, I consider my core audience
Yep.
or my core humans. So I seek to design services or activities that meet their needs, so helping them feel like a community.
Yep.
We also work a lot around education, because one of the challenges for the country in lots of different industries, but in particular cybersecurity, is the talent pipeline.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily have all of the bright young minds we need to fill the skills gap that we're going to see. And if we look at what's happening in the world, it's a pretty challenging geopolitical environment, and cybersecurity is definitely a tool that is used by nefarious actors to impact the day-to-day lives of different states and territories. So that education piece is really important to us. And I would say the other piece that's not necessarily a focus from an industry perspective, but diversity and inclusion. If you think about, Survivor, the TV show,
Yep.
and you're building your team, you want to make sure you pick people with different skill sets and different perspectives, because you're going to have to be solving really tricky problems. Same with a board game. Same with cybersecurity. Some of the puzzles and some of the challenges we're going to see in the next few years are going to be truly terrifyingly difficult. And we're only going to be able to overcome them and to develop great cybersecurity tools, defense mechanisms, plans, if we have diverse, great teams. So we want to make sure we're attracting people who are underrepresented in the cybersecurity industry. So we have, the dream team that we need to secure our state.
You spoke about that shortage. What's the impact of that cybersecurity talent shortage? Even trying to be diverse, trying to be inclusive, trying to find the right people on your team. If we would just think about Australia, what do you see, or what is your perspective on what's the potential impact of that talent shortage when it comes to cybersecurity?
Well, I try not to be a fearmongerer, because cyber's got a bad rap, and there are so many positive stories to tell. But if you look at the data, it is a little bit scary. AustCyber actually produced some data last year that came out in their sector competitiveness plan, SCP. Sector competitiveness plan, and depending on that, we're under a couple thousand up to 20,000 actual professionals in
Just
the industry. Just in Australia. So globally, we know that there's an emerging shortage, and we also know that right now it's really hard to recruit anyway in Western Australia in particular. So it's about finding the right fit. I think it's about inspiring younger people to join the cybersecurity profession, but also thinking through mid-career professionals who might be looking for the next challenge. When my parents went through their careers, they stayed in the same job for 20, 30, 40 years. Now what we're seeing is people do a mid-career pivot. And so what we're also trying to do is to harness that energy. Cybersecurity is something you can do remotely. It's something you can do from a regional hub. So we're trying to make sure we tell those stories. It's great for women who are returning to work, because there's shift work options, there's flexible work options. So there's definitely scope for us to increase the talent pipeline, but we need to make sure we're communicating in a way that doesn't put people off with the stereotypes. Everybody thinks it's a hacker living in their parents' basement who is a cybersecurity professional or a cybersecurity criminal. And that's really not true. Some of the cybercrime waves we're seeing, there's really sophisticated organised crime operations. Like the people who are attacking Australians, they have KPIs. They're not doing it because they liked attacking Australia. They're doing it because Australia is a pretty easy target, and they're going to hit their goals, and they might get a bonus before Christmas. So it's really quite well organised, and for some foreign states, it's one of their main sources of income. So we're up against serious threats. So I think making sure we dispel some of the negative stereotypes about, you have to wear a hoodie. Although I do have a hoodie. I don't wear it very often in this role, but, I try to connect with my community. That does put certain people off. Particularly, I think, women, people from underrepresented groups. And cyber is also about caring for your community. You want people to be safe. You want your parents to make sure that they're their Black Friday sale purchases, they're not being scammed.
Yeah.
You want them to make sure that they're okay. And the best way to secure a community is to be from that community. So if you think about all of the different vulnerable people we have in WA, whether you're from a remote community, whether you're elderly, whether English is your second or third or fourth language, training people from those communities to help secure those communities and look after them is really important. And I think that's a really strong narrative that I try and share. It's about care.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily about defense or, the scary threats out there. It's about how do we make sure we're building people with the skills we need to look after their communities.
Talking of those communities, if you were to look at WA when it comes to cybersecurity, like how would you describe the maturity of just Western Australia? You see a lot of businesses, a lot of not-for-profits, education institutions. You have this full kind of spectrum view of the state. How would you describe WA's cybersecurity maturity?
Well, I am a WA homegrown girl, so I never like to say bad things. But unfortunately, some of the data does show that our maturity isn't as good as some of the other states if we compare nationally.
Yep.
Certainly in terms of business email compromise,
Yep.
which is when somebody will access your computer and perhaps replace the invoice details or impersonate your boss. And so when they say, Cecily, make that urgent payment, you're like, oh, better do that on a Friday afternoon. Things like that. So business email compromise, or BEC, is quite common. And the stats don't reflect well per capita compared to the other states and territories.
So WA's got a higher incidence of
higher
BEC.
incidence. And that could be because we're good at reporting it, but it also could be that we're not at that maturity level. I think it really depends also on which industry you're from. We do know that the nonprofit and social impact sectors sometimes don't have access to the budgets necessary to make sure they're at the cutting edge of different digital evolutions. I do also believe that the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act that was updated, I believe, 2021, early 2022, has changed Australia's perspective on cyber, and in particularly WA, because we have so many things that are so important to the rest of the country that are classified as critical here in Western Australia. So I think that maturity level and that support from the federal government and that communication has changed. But the gap that I really do see is small business, which worries me because they're the lifeblood of our economy. They're so important, and it's a very Australian thing to run a small business, and it worries me that they're not as safe and secure as they need to be.
And so why is that? Why are small businesses kind of more exposed, more under mature compared to where they should be? Like, why is that happening in WA? What's driving that?
Well, if I take my human-centered lens and I try and use empathy, and because I technically run a small nonprofit, but if I think about what small business owners have been through in the last 3 years in Australia, they've had a pretty rough trot. So perhaps they've had other priorities. Recruiting's really hard. We know that turnover's been higher because of that market. Rents are increasing, so margins are getting smaller. There are so many other competing priorities. I think one of the challenges is that the understanding that cyber isn't a nice to have. It's an essential. It's an enabler. If you have an online shop, you need to have good cybersecurity. If you're collecting any data for your customers, you need to have good cybersecurity. We have lots of stories of small businesses that we've worked through the Cyber Check Me program with, which is in the middle of being reinvented. But we had a small food and beverage company, to say, from one of the northern suburbs, and they had a cyber breach, and the hackers stole their database. So I think it was around this time of year. So the silly season is coming up. You're running a cocktail company. Every booking, all your customer details, all of the invoice numbers. So your entire livelihood is gone. And they actually went bust because they couldn't rebuild the business. They didn't have the contact numbers of their clients. So they couldn't say, hey, can you please confirm the venue tomorrow? Our systems are down, but we'll still be there for you. They literally couldn't contact their customers. So if you think about that, how could your business survive if you lost your customer database tomorrow? Could you survive?
Great question.
And so I think it's understanding what a cyber attack could look like, and then how do you put in the basics or the bare minimum to make sure that you have a good backup. Because depending on the sensitivity of the data you're collecting, you may not need super stringent controls. You may just need to do, they call it cyber hygiene, which I don't really like.
You don't like the word cyber hygiene?
No, you know, we're living in this post-COVID reality. It reminds me of hand sanitizer and masks, but it's similar. It's the day-to-day things you need to do. Every time you go to the toilet, you wash your hands. Every time you make a new password, you need to make sure it's a good password. And you should probably put it in your password manager or use a passphrase, like really basic, but so much easier to remember, and it's much harder to crack because it's much longer. So things like that, I think people don't know what they can do. It's one of those hard, scary, difficult things. It seems a bit frustrating. It's almost like tax, you know. It's kind of, oh, I know I've got to do it, but you don't get a fine if you don't do your cybersecurity on time. You're just more at risk, and those risks we don't really need to take. One of the trends that I have witnessed in Western Australia that isn't my favourite either is a lot of small business in Western Australia are part of bigger supply chains. And what we're seeing is that the larger end of town are trying to reduce their supply chain risk because third-party cyber breaches is a common method. And what we want to see is that those larger players helping the small businesses in their supply chain improve their cyber capability so they can keep working with them. But unfortunately, if the small business isn't in a position to think through that as an opportunity, they then lose the opportunity to do business with that organisation, and they choose someone that can fill out the cyber questionnaire better, who understands the risk, and they just move. And what we're seeing is that if it's not a small business, it's generally a large multinational because they have strong cyber systems in place. And that's a real... I don't like using the word threat, but that's just a real missed opportunity for WA. You know, we want to make sure that our small businesses are included in those supply chains, that they have been for the last 50 years, but we don't want to lose that opportunity in the future because you can't bid for the tender or you can't fill out the questionnaire because you get kicked out in the procurement process because you don't have the essential 8. You don't have a certification of cyber. You don't have a policy or a system in place that you can demonstrate to the people you're doing business with that actually you're a secure business to work with.
When it comes to being secure and having a system to secure, or like you spoke about Essential 8, the government's doing a lot of work on promoting Essential 8. There's other standards like ISO 27001, which many people are familiar with. Quality standard, that's a cybersecurity management standard. For the lay business owner who's hearing this Essential 8, how would you unpack that for them to say, hey, here's what it is at a very high level? Obviously, don't have to go through all the 8.
That's great.
But because I never remember it either. So, but if you were just trying to explain to them, here's what the Essential 8 is, and here's why it's important that you're familiar with it, and you've alluded to it because you could miss out on opportunities. It could cost your business money in the supply chain. So what is the Essential 8 at a high level, and why is it important that small businesses pay attention to it?
Well, if I can use an analogy, the Essential 8 is like a very bad slip, slop, slap campaign. It's those 3 basic things that you need to do, but it's 8 basic things that you need to do. And if you do those, you really dramatically reduce your cyber risk without spending too much money. So that was created by the Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre to be used as a standard for Australian industry. So there are 8 different things you can do. They're essential. And you know, perhaps they're not necessarily that easily understood by a layperson. As somebody who's come from a international security background, I had to learn, what does hardening my system mean? You know, it's a computer. Generally, they're quite hard. You know, things like that. So they're really written from that technical perspective. However, the ACSC at cyber.gov.au have some pretty good small business toolkits to help you translate what actually are the Essential 8 and what you should do to get them done. And you can use that as also a tool to communicate with your cybersecurity provider or your IT provider, because a lot of people outsource their IT and have managed service providers, and some of them have cyber specialists, some of them don't. But if you can say, hey, the Essential 8, I just learnt about this. What should I be doing? Are we on track for that? How do I do a bit of an audit? How do I understand where I'm at? So it's a useful tool, I believe. I think in terms of making sure it's more accessible and more easily understood by the average business owner, there is some work to do. And I do believe that the Australian Cybersecurity Strategy that was launched just last week in November, Minister Claire O'Neil has created something that I think is highly ambitious, but looks like a really useful tool as well. That strategy does support small business. Shield 1 is strong businesses and strong citizens. So if we really think about that, they're trying to scale funding that already exists for things like cyber health checks. Everybody goes to a tax clinic. We need to get people going to the cyber clinics. So things like that I think are really important. Essential 8 is a useful tool, but the language isn't necessarily accessible in my humble opinion. And I think translating the technical and the human aspects of cyber is something that we really focus on at the CyberWest Hub, and certainly CyberWest Summit is where we really try and bring the business community and the cyber community together, because we all know that it's much more fun to go to a party where we already know everybody and we all are singing from the same hymn sheet or speaking the same language. And cyber really needs to start crossing out of that community and engaging with business. So CyberWest Summit is where we bring everybody together and make sure that we deliver content in a really accessible, tangible look. You have a small business, you focus on consulting. These are the 3 things you need to get done in the next few months to make sure you reduce your risk.
And sorry, I was going to ask you, the CyberWest Summit, it's a 2-day event. It's been very successful. You've brought together, I think the code word you used was it's the security summit for non-security people. And you've had a lot of amazing speakers in there. What are you hoping that will do for the WA business community? Is that you're wanting to educate, you're wanting to empower? Like, what is your overall goal of the CyberWest Summit?
Thanks so much. I think those 2 words really resonate. So it's the education piece without feeling that you can't ask your silly question. I think making sure it's a safe space where you can say, like, I just don't get it. What is the essential 8? Why do I bother? And you're like, well, your database is probably really important to you. Or do you use swipe access cards? And what happens if they went down? And how would your factory operate if some of your digital systems didn't work for 3 days? So I think it's having that education piece for business owners writ large, because so many people have challenges that affect whether in construction, whether in logistics, food and groceries. That's part of the critical infrastructure assets. How many IGAs do we think that we work with? And when we saw the supply chain issues with the floods in South Australia and the groceries and the supermarkets were empty, it was really stressful. So how do we make sure we think about, oh, by the way, you wouldn't think IGA is an interesting cyber target, but it is if you're trying to disrupt life for an average Australian. So how do we both educate and then empower so people feel, actually, it's not that bad. I can do something about it. I understand what my cyber risk is. And, okay, I can do these few things by myself. I can get a password manager. I can run a few training sessions for my team. But who should run the training session? And then introduce them to the right partners in the cybersecurity industry. Because we do have a thriving cybersecurity industry in WA. And there are so many different products and services, it can be overwhelming to understand what you actually need. And if you've got a huge organizations and you have lots of networks, you might need a network detection platform. But if you're a small business, you might just need someone to run a really thoughtful, easy to understand training program for your executive team or your managers, your senior managers. So understanding who are those people and who can deliver the right service or product for your team is the purpose of CyberWest Summit.
Okay.
So you go along, you're like, oh, I actually understand that. Oh, I didn't realize, I'm trying to build business with the Department of Health or, medical providers. That's critical infrastructure. How do I demonstrate my cybersecurity so I can win better business? It's going to be a real comparative advantage. And the huge opportunity for Western Australia is the AUKUS arrangement with Pillar 1 and Pillar 2.
Can you unpack, so for those that don't know what AUKUS is, and my guess are around the production with the US government and manufacturing and defence. Could you unpack that a bit for people?
And I guess it's because I'm an international relations nerd that I care about it. It's a treaty that's been signed by Australia, the UK and the US, focusing on around defence and security pillars. And Pillar 1 is the submarines. I'm sure everybody saw in the news about, that we will be servicing in WA nuclear submarines that are going to be used all around the world to support the defence of Australia, the US and the UK at the minimum. So if you think about maybe you're a plumber or a concreter, HMAS Sterling down Rockingham Way, they're going to have huge construction. Everybody working on that construction will need the right kind of clearance and to be able to demonstrate their cybersecurity capability. how do we make sure that our local companies and our local suppliers don't miss out on that opportunity? That's something that I think is really exciting, because that really makes sure that we, uplift the capability of all of those small businesses to a standard that's internationally recognised when they decide on it.
Yep.
My understanding from my research is that they haven't quite figured out which framework, whether it's ISO 27001, which is really fun to say, or whether it's NIST, or whether it's the Essential 8, or whichever. There are so many frameworks, and that's also one of the aims of the summit, is that it's confusing to understand which framework applies to me. What should I be doing? So we've mapped everything to the Western Australian cybersecurity policy and tried to make that easy to understand. But if you think about AUKUS, Pillar 2 is around cyber as well. So how do we bring Australian cyber companies into this global supply chain and get connected to business internationally?
Yeah.
So there's lots of opportunities that we wouldn't think through necessarily.
Yeah.
And I think that cyber is more exciting. It's not the buzzword of the moment.
Yeah.
And AI is going to make cyber threats even harder to detect. If you imagine your spam emails, there won't be any spelling mistakes in your spam email anymore, because it won't be written by a cyber criminal. It'll be put through ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And so if you think about that, it's going to get harder as individuals to spot scams and cyber attacks and phishing campaigns. Phishing campaign is when they send you a dodgy link and you click on it, and then all hell breaks loose. So it's going to get harder for us because of some of the digital innovations we're seeing with AI. But as long as we're aware of that and we're doing our best, we can really reduce our risk. It's never going to be zero, I hate to say, but we can really reduce it. And that's the message that I like to promote, is that it's not all doom and gloom. You can do some things about it. And if you need to know who to talk to, let me put you in touch with the right kind of people.
You spoke before about people being on the space of, I need to get a cybersecurity kind of platform, or I should say accreditation, for opportunity. And we've spoken before about business who are at risk in the supply chain. We spoke about people who are going to be more exposed because of the advent of AI. Are businesses still acknowledging cyber risk though? We're seeing it at the big end of town, we're seeing it in the news. What about those small businesses? How many of them have got to the point, and again, you spoke about competing priorities, how many of those small businesses are realising it is a significant risk they need to act on now?
If I'm honest, I don't think enough. And I'm going to be very honest, because that's generally how I work, possibly too honest at times. So we just had Cyber Week, which is part of Cyber Awareness Month in October. And we ran multiple events. We talked about cyber for the space industry and how the space supply chain is a huge opportunity as well, because if you think about remote operations, if somebody gets into your remote ops for your spaceship, we've got a real problem. We had a beautiful engagement moment called Scams and Scones with senior citizens, so delivering kind of content in a kind way about all of the different things they could be aware about and the basics that they can do to reduce their risk, because it's quite scary as an older person with the digital revolution, what not to click on and all the text you get. But unfortunately, our small business event wasn't as well attended as I would have wanted. So I reflect on that, and I think perhaps that's how I marketed it. Maybe it was my communication, but we do find that small business market hard to engage with. And so when I think about it, yes, I can do better in how I market and how I communicate with that group, and using the different channels, like working with business associations and different groups and leaders to make sure that we're engaging through existing platforms. But at the same time, it means to me that small businesses don't see cyber as a priority. The AI events always sell out. They're much cooler than us at the moment, and I think the next cool kids are going to be quantum.
Okay.
And that's a whole other set of challenges we'll
That's
have to deal with
another
in a few.
podcast,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's another podcast in a few years. We're not there yet, but WA also should be a leader in quantum business, because we do have the Pawsey supercomputer here, and we're going to have one of the largest quantum computers in the world on our doorstep. And with that, combined with our cyber capabilities, huge opportunity. But that is a separate podcast. So yeah, I don't know enough about why small business owners are not either accessing some of the events or the tools that we provide, whether they're busy with other things at this time of year in October, there's too much going on, or they're just not recognising it as a risk. A lot of small businesses I've heard anecdotally are using AI to automate some of their systems, to write HR policy.
Yeah.
Not sure about that, or to make their lives a little bit easier. But AI doesn't have the same traction as AI at the moment, and so cyber can make your life easier because you're reducing your risk, and you won't necessarily have to have that horrible conversation with your customers or, oh, sorry, we're not online for a day. We saw what happened with Optus and how that just went down and that affected so many people. Imagine if that wasn't, you couldn't say, oh, that was because of Optus. You're like, oh, that was because of me. That's really hard for a small business, and you do lose your takings for a couple of days. And so it's definitely a real risk. Haven't figured out. We're trying to do a bit of a design thinking process around it and use some of my skills to understand the issue, because I need to talk to more small business owners and say, hey, how do you see cyber? Is it a priority for you? Are you overwhelmed with the options out there? Is it you don't know who to trust? Or is it just because payroll, this, that, the other are more important on the day-to-day, and it just gets pushed down to the bottom of the to-do list? And unfortunately, cyber isn't something you can do on an annual basis. It's something you have to do every day.
And anecdotally on that point, I mean, we've seen another, maybe it's an assumption or maybe it's a gap, is that people are assuming they're already cyber secure. You know, so it's almost like a false positive. It's like, I think my cyber's taken care of and I'm fine.
Oh, the IT guys got it.
Yeah, like someone somewhere's got it, either internally or externally, and then they end up getting compromised or something happens. And so they're almost none the wiser. You know, I actually thought it was done. It was kind of like, I thought I locked the back door and I still had a security incident. So for those business owners who think, I'm confident I've locked the back door, but I don't actually know how to lock, and I didn't make the lock, I don't use the lock every day, like, how would you talk to them about getting confidence in knowing they're protected?
So my first step is always to check in with your IT provider. We have a lot of smaller businesses who outsource a lot of things, and that's fine, and that model works. But just ask a few key questions and ask your managed service provider, so your MMSP, what is my level of cyber risk? Can you do a bit of an audit? What is your opinion? How are you managing that? Just having that basic understanding and asking those questions will give you a better understanding of where you sit. And there are different risk calculation metrics that they can then provide you. And if they can't answer your questions, that's also very telling, because maybe they don't have it. And maybe then you need to think that through more thoughtfully about which providers you're going with and why. But also you can't outsource that risk, because unfortunately, if you're the small business owner, you're probably the biggest risk. There are lots of stories about, you know, people who are trying to get a jump on their emails while watching their son's cricket game. And then you just, oh, that's urgent, better do that. And then you've suddenly given somebody else accidental access to systems. And if you think through a cyber criminal, they generally don't, well, they either look for the little fish to catch the big fish, or they just target the big fish because they have access to all of the systems. Because who does payroll? Who manages the bank account? Who does all of these things? It's the big fish. So they're the ones who are most targeted. So you can outsource some of the issues and the technical issues, but the human issues, you need to lead by example. You need to upskill yourself. You need to make sure your team is trained. And when they join the team, is like, this is how we do things here, and this is why. Two-factor authentication, you know, the annoying text message. The annoying text message reduces your risk infinitely, and it's something really simple. It does take a few extra minutes every time you log into something, but it's so helpful, because that's how you know somebody's in your system sometimes. That's how you know who've been breached, because you got a text message that you didn't get.
Yeah. You were talking before about like empowering your team and training them. I mean, we're always fond of saying cybersecurity is the new digital occupational health and safety.
Agreed.
You have to train your people. Like, what advice would you give to business owners thinking about how to train people when they don't know what to train? So where do they start on that journey of educating themselves and their staff around just the basics of, and you spoke about it before, cybersecurity hygiene?
So, there are a lot of free resources out there. Things that we run during Cyber Awareness Week do help people understand some of those basics. There are different ways to frame human risk, the ultimate endpoint, the biggest risk in your supply chain. But I think if you think through a human-centered lens, like how do you actually change your team's behavior? It's basically positive reinforcement and also thinking about what they truly care about. And if you think about what you truly, truly care about, you care about your granny, you care about your mum, you care about your family. So framing your training exercises, I'm working with somebody who's running those training exercises that helps you reduce your personal cyber risk. That means all of your professional behaviours will change as well. So the compliance lens and the tick box doesn't really work, and people don't really change their behaviour, or they do sometimes, but then they accidentally take their laptop home on the weekend to get ahead on something, and then they use a USB and then they stick it in a few different computers and the Officeworks printer. And so thinking through how you tell stories about, look, if you use a password manager and you set up this, you can help your family do that. That really helps change people's behaviour. And reducing an individual's cyber risk reduces your business risk. And there's also some really innovative, cool organisations that we work with here in WA who do tabletop exercises. So if you think it through, it's almost like a fire drill, but for cyber. So they can take you through a scenario where there is a cyber breach or there is a cyber attack, and you're like, what do we actually do? Where is our backup plan? Do we have a backup plan? So those sorts of exercises are really helpful. A business continuity plan. So you have a backup of your database. So you don't have to cancel your booking on Saturday night because you know how to contact the client. You've already downloaded the venue. You've got all that information.
Can we ask that question around when it comes to business continuity? A lot of businesses just think, well, I've got to keep the lights on. And that's the limit of, their thought around business continuity. If you're talking to someone about business continuity, how would you describe what it is and why it's important? When it comes to cyber?
When it comes to cyber, it's really about, I believe, having a plan that people are actually across and is actually tested. And whether that's keeping the lights on or whether it's what are our key goals? Like, what are our goals for our business if we have to be offline or if we can't access these systems? What is our workaround? How do I still make payroll? All of the things that are critical to your business, thinking through them and then doing a bit of a test. Because often it's a policy that we spin up and we keep in a drawer. We've never actually thought to test it or to try and use it. And that means that when we need it, it's not very helpful. Perhaps somebody used ChatGPT to write it and it's just completely defunct. So I think that's really important in deciding what are your lights, like what do you actually want to keep on? Is it, if it's a business that is a retail business, is it actually keeping people in the shop? Or is it keeping your online shop going? Like, what is actually the most important for your goals as a business owner? I think thinking through that and doing a little bit of that testing is really important. And then to go with the business continuity plan, I think crisis communications or having a communications plan is super important. We've all known how not to do it. I think the last 2 years in Australia have really shown us the importance of thoughtful and constant communication with your customers, because they need to know that you're working on it, and you need to be as open as possible as you can, I think, to rebuild any trust, because it does do reputational damage, which is really unfortunate. But you also want to know that your customers to know that you've done your best to reduce your risk.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So wrapping up, if we were thinking about your role at Cyber West Hub, the impact it makes in the Perth community, small businesses, thinking through all these different areas, what would be your top 3 pieces of advice? So if you were sitting across, from an owner at a barbecue and you told him you're in cybersecurity, what would be your top 3 pieces of advice would you give to a small business owner when it comes to cybersecurity?
Well, I see small business owners as kind of part of mini communities in a way. So I probably would tell, one piece of advice is like, but do you want to look after your customers? How do you look after your customers? And tell a little bit of that care narrative. Like, how are you helping make sure that your customers are safe as well as you? So thinking through cyber is not necessarily just attack, but also safety and making sure you're doing the occupational health and safety thing. I would also ask them who manages their cybersecurity, and if they didn't know, I would say, oh, maybe you should probably find out, because if you can't answer the question and your IT manager can't answer the question, or your managed service provider can't answer the question, that's very telling, and that probably gives you some information that you could do something useful with. And then to be curious. Cyber's not that scary, and some of the real tangible basics, you know, I would ask him if he had multi-factor authentication. Like, do you get the annoying text messages? Because that's going to transform your business risk.
Yeah.
Do you know what the essential 8 is? And if they don't, I was like, well, there's a bunch of free resources online. If you have any trouble, I can point you in the right direction for somebody who can help you translate. I think the real challenge for cyber is storytelling in a way that resonates with everybody, because it isn't the IT guy's problem. Unfortunately, it's everybody's problem. And if we want to see a prosperous and happy Australia, we need to do better. We need to uplift our capability. And the big end of town, they've got the budgets to do what they need to. So the small end of town, we're here to help. And we're always open to advice to help understand small business. And Cyber West Summit, we really feel, is a value add for the community, because it brings everybody together in a way that you're allowed to ask, what does hardening mean?
So you've been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. Where can people find you online, and where can people find more information about the Cyber West Hub?
So Cyber West Hub on LinkedIn is a great way to understand about all of our events, the opportunities available. We also have, if you have cousins, mums, friends, students who are excited about a cyber career, we have another LinkedIn profile called Students of Cyber, and that's when we make sure we connect future cyber professionals with current cyber professionals to understand all of the different career pathways to get there, because you don't necessarily have to do a degree. There's lots of ways to pivot into that career. So I would say LinkedIn's a really great communications tool for us, and then also cyberwest.au.
Yeah.
But yeah, really happy. Thank you so much for the chat.
Thank you.